June 5th, 1944, and Dwight Eisenhower sits alone in a trailer at Southwick House in Portsmouth, holding two letters he wrote himself. One announces victory, and the other accepts full responsibility for catastrophic failure. 12 hours from now, he'll launch Operation Overlord with 150,000 troops and 5,000 ships in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. But the strategic genius that made D-Day work had nothing to do with scale. What actually determined success was a resource allocation framework that Geoffrey Moore would accidentally rediscover in Silicon Valley 50 years later, that Peter Thiel would articulate as monopolizing small markets in 0 to 1, and that most startups still get catastrophically wrong today. This connection isn't metaphorical. The principles operate identically, the sequence unfolds the same way, and the fatal mistakes when you ignore them look exactly alike, whether you're landing troops or launching products. You came here for startup advice, and I'm going to give it to you, but stay with me in 1944 for a few more minutes first. Watch SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Figured out about beach landings is exactly what separates companies that achieve product-market fit from companies that burn through their runway, attacking everywhere at once. Once you see how the connection works, you'll never think about go-to-market strategy the same way again. The problem Eisenhower faced in early 1944 looked like strength on paper. The Allies possessed more planes than Germany, more ships, more men, and more industrial capacity than the Axis powers could match. And yet the invasion could still fail catastrophically, because having superior total force means nothing if you can't concentrate that force at the point of contact. This is the fundamental problem of amphibious assault, and it's the same problem Clausewitz identified in On War a century earlier when he wrote about the principle of concentration. You're attacking from the sea against an entrenched defender who can move troops anywhere along the coast faster than you can sail. That defender has spent years building fortifications and knows the terrain intimately. The moment your troops hit the beach, they're at their most vulnerable, seasick and disorganized and wet, taking fire with no cover. The traditional military answer would be overwhelming force everywhere, but that approach collapses under scrutiny. You can't maintain strength everywhere simultaneously because you don't have infinite ships or infinite landing craft. More critically, you don't have infinite supply capacity, and every soldier needs food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies, while every tank needs shells and every plane needs a runway. Eisenhower's planning staff solved this constraint by inventing what military historians now call the beachhead strategy. You don't try to liberate France on day one, and you don't even try to liberate Normandy. Instead, you pick a tiny stretch of coastline, 50 miles out of thousands, and concentrate everything you have right there. Your goal isn't to win the war in the first wave. Your goal is to establish a secure lodgment, a foothold, a position you can hold and expand from over time. Normandy's beaches weren't chosen because they offered the best landing conditions in France. Operation Fortitude, the deception campaign that convinced Hitler the real invasion would strike, Pas-de-Calais, made Normandy viable by keeping German panzer divisions waiting for an attack that would never come. The terrain behind those beaches allowed for consolidation, the logistics worked, and Hitler's reserves stayed fixed in the wrong place. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword each possessed specific characteristics that made them suitable for the narrow mission of establishing a beachhead. And here's where everything shifts. Once you hold a beachhead, the dynamics reverse completely. Now you're the defender with interior lines, and you can build up forces faster than the enemy can mass against you. British engineers had invented Mulberry harbors, ingenious portable ports, assembled from massive concrete caissons and floating piers, and suddenly you have supply infrastructure the enemy can't easily destroy. The beachhead isn't the end goal. It functions as the enabling position, the foundation that makes everything else possible afterward. General Omar Bradley called this concept the hinge of fate, and Churchill, characteristically dramatic, called it the most difficult and complicated operation ever to take place. Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group spent months planning the exact sequence of expansion from those initial 50 miles because the expansion phase mattered just as much as the landing itself. But strip away the military language, and here's what the beachhead strategy actually represents: a resource allocation framework for attacking a larger, entrenched competitor when you have finite resources and they don't. Now, let's talk about your startup and why this matters for you directly. That beachhead strategy translates almost perfectly to early-stage company building. Military planners think in terms of beaches, and startup operators think in terms of market segments. Landing craft capacity in military terms becomes burn rate and sales bandwidth in startup terms. Enemy fortifications translate directly to incumbent competitors with established customer relationships, distribution networks, and switching costs that take years to build. The mechanism operates identically in both domains, and only the materials differ. Geoffrey Moore figured this out in 1991 when he wrote Crossing the Chasm and called it the beachhead market, probably without fully realizing he'd borrowed a term that came directly from Operation Overlord. Moore's insight identified why early-stage technology companies fail when they try to serve too many market segments simultaneously. They spread limited resources across multiple beaches and fail to establish a defensible position in any of them. Mark Andreessen would later call this failing to find product-market fit, but the mechanism Moore identified concerned resource allocation, not product quality. Most people miss that this represents a logistics problem rather than a product problem. Your product might perform exactly as designed, and your vision might prove correct over time, but if you're attacking 5 market segments with resources suited for one, you're going to get pushed back into the sea on all 5 fronts. Let me show you how each principle from Normandy translates to company building and why ignoring any one of them can kill your company before you reach profitability. The first principle operates under the name force concentration. June 1944 offered the Allies the option of spreading their invasion across the entire French coast. A few divisions in Brittany, a few in Normandy, a few at Pas-de-Calais would have covered all the options and hedged the bets nicely on paper. That approach would have proven catastrophic in practice. Each landing force would have lacked the mass to overcome local defenses, and the Germans could have defeated each isolated attack in sequence, using their interior lines to concentrate against one beach at a time. Eisenhower rejected that approach and concentrated 150,000 troops on a 50-mile front instead. The ratio mattered enormously in execution. At Omaha Beach, despite the carnage you've seen recreated in Saving Private Ryan, the Americans maintained roughly a 2-to-1 advantage over the defending German 352nd Infantry Division. Utah Beach offered even better odds, closer to 4-to-1, because the preliminary bombardment had proven more effective there. These margins allowed American forces to establish positions even when individual units got pinned down, even when DD tanks sank in the rough seas, even when paratroopers landed miles from their designated drop zones. Now translate this directly to startups. The most common failure mode, which I call Calais syndrome after the beach Eisenhower deliberately chose not to invade, looks like strategic ambition from the outside. What it actually represents is strategic cowardice in disguise. Attacking everywhere feels easier because you never have to commit to anything, never have to declare that you're abandoning a segment, never have to watch a competitor win a market you chose to walk away from. Startups with horizontal products, offerings that could theoretically serve many industries, attack all of them simultaneously. They show up at healthcare conferences, fintech conferences, and manufacturing trade shows in the same quarter. They build features for enterprise customers and small businesses at the same time. They spread their sales team across 8 verticals and then struggle to understand why traction remains elusive in every single one. What happens looks predictable in hindsight. They achieve 5% penetration in each segment and 95% penetration in none, which means they have no reference customers to point to when prospects ask for proof. Word of mouth within specific communities never develops, deep understanding of any single customer's workflow never accumulates, and density of users who talk to each other never materializes. They've attacked Calais and Normandy and Brittany with forces suited for one beach, and the sea claims all of them. Y Combinator's Paul Graham wrote about this pattern using different language. It's better to have 100 users who love you than a million who kind of like you. That statement captures the beachhead principle exactly. Those 100 users who love you represent your Normandy, and the million who kind of like you represent the French coastline you haven't earned the right to attack yet. The actionable insight here demands specificity. Pick one market segment, one that's small enough to dominate with your current resources, but valuable enough to sustain your operations. Find one where you can achieve that 2-to-1 ratio against incumbent alternatives. Don't aim for the biggest segment or the most obvious segment. Aim for the one you can actually win with the resources you have today. Stripe executed this approach starting in 2010. They could have targeted all online businesses from day one, but they focused almost exclusively on developers at startups instead. That segment looked tiny on paper, but developers talk to other developers constantly. They share tools in GitHub repos and Hacker News threads without being asked. Stripe became the default choice in that community and achieved true density and dominance before expanding to enterprises years later. They established their beachhead before attempting to liberate all of e-commerce. Liquid Death executed a similar approach in a completely different industry. They could have launched in grocery stores and competed directly against Dasani and Aquafina for shelf space, where Pepsi's distribution advantages would have crushed them. Instead, they established their beachhead in convenience stores near skate parks, tattoo parlors, and music venues, places where their irreverent branding resonated deeply and where mainstream competitors had no interest in fighting. They dominated a tiny segment that major competitors wouldn't contest, then expanded from that position of strength once they'd proven the concept. But here's the thing. Force concentration isn't even the most important principle from Normandy. The second principle operates under the name logistics before glory. Most people misunderstand what actually determined D-Day's outcome. The heroic footage everyone remembers, soldiers storming beaches under machine gun fire and rangers climbing the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, captures the dramatic moments but misses the substance. Logistics won or lost that invasion, and specifically those Mulberry harbors decided everything. Capturing a beach creates an immediate problem because beaches don't have ports. You can't supply an army over open sand for more than a few days. Ships need protected unloading areas sheltered from weather and tides. Trucks need fuel depots positioned correctly. Soldiers need field hospitals within reach. Ammunition needs to flow forward faster than combat expends it. German strategists understood this constraint perfectly, and their plans centered on destroying the major ports at Cherbourg and Le Havre, then letting the Allies wither on the beach as their supply lines collapsed. No amount of heroism overcomes logistics failure. Napoleon learned this lesson in Russia, where the Grande Armée didn't collapse from combat losses, but from supply chain disintegration across the frozen expanse. Alexander the Great understood the same principle 2,000 years earlier and planned supply depots before every major battle, never advancing faster than his logistics could sustain. British engineers solved the D-Day logistics problem with a solution that sounded insane when first proposed. They built artificial harbors in England using massive concrete caissons, floating piers, and breakwaters constructed from deliberately sunken ships, then towed everything across the channel in pieces and assembled it off the Normandy coast. Within days of the landing, Allies unloaded 7,000 tons of supplies daily through ports that hadn't existed a week earlier. When a storm destroyed the American Mulberry Harbor on June 19th, the British installation at Arromanches kept the entire invasion supplied until Cherbourg finally fell and its port facilities could be cleared for use. The engineering achievement matters less than the sequencing insight it represents. Eisenhower's staff understood that supply infrastructure had to be planned before the invasion launched, not figured out afterward under pressure. Glory, meaning the race to Paris and the push into Germany, had to wait until logistics could sustain the advance. Every general wants to sprint toward the capital. The generals who win sprint toward the supply depot first. Translate this to startups, and the parallel becomes obvious. Mulberry harbors correspond to your operational infrastructure, your unit economics, your customer success capacity, your onboarding process, and your ability to actually serve the customers you acquire without destroying your margins or burning out your team. I've watched startups raise Series A rounds and immediately triple their sales headcount without improving their onboarding process first. They acquire customers faster than they can make those customers successful, which means NPS craters within months, churn spikes to unsustainable levels, and support tickets overwhelm the team until everyone burns out. They captured the beach, but couldn't hold it because their supply lines didn't exist yet. That's not a growth problem at all. That's a logistics failure, and it's exactly what German planners counted on happening at Normandy. This explains why the best startup operators obsess over CAC payback periods, gross margin, and net revenue retention before they obsess over growth rate. Revenue you can't profitably fulfill resembles territory you can't supply. You'll have to give it back eventually, whether through churn, margin compression, or team burnout that hollows out your organization. Slack understood this dynamic before scaling their sales team. They built self-serve onboarding that let teams adopt the product without human intervention, investing in what platform engineers now call infrastructure as competitive advantage, the operational equivalent of Mulberry Harbors. They could land thousands of new teams per week because they'd built systems that didn't require proportional headcount growth to function. That infrastructure multiplied the effectiveness of every subsequent investment they made. The question to ask yourself operates simply. If your sales doubled next month, would your company get better or worse as a result? If the answer points toward worse, you don't have a growth problem. You have a logistics problem. Fix the harbor before you land more troops. Every resource you spend on growth before your infrastructure can support it represents a resource wasted on territory you can't hold. The third principle operates under the name air superiority before ground assault, and it's subtle but absolutely essential. Operation Overlord didn't begin on June 6, 1944. The real start came months earlier with Operation Point Blank, the combined British and American strategic bombing campaign that systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies over France. By the time D-Day arrived, Allied air forces had achieved such complete dominance that German planes barely appeared over the beaches at all. The few that showed up went down within minutes. Pilots of the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command had spent months and sacrificed thousands of lives establishing the conditions that made the ground war possible in the first place. Air superiority mattered because it allowed everything else to function. Troops could land without being strafed from above. Ships could approach the coast without facing bombing runs. Supply convoys could move inland without interdiction. Reconnaissance aircraft could spot German counterattacks before they reached the beaches and call in defensive measures. The ground war became possible only because the air war had already been won before a single soldier stepped onto the sand. The startup equivalent goes by the name category awareness. Before you can sell a product, your target customers need to understand the category that product exists in. They need to feel the problem acutely before they'll seek a solution, and they need vocabulary to describe what you do when talking to colleagues. Most startups reverse this sequence completely. They hire salespeople before their target market knows the category exists, and then those salespeople spend 90% of their calls educating prospects on why the problem matters, why the old way fails, and why this new approach deserves consideration. Only 10% of their time goes to actual selling. That's not sales at all. That's expensive marketing with a quota attached, and you're asking ground troops to accomplish what the Air Force should have handled first. Epidemiologists would recognize this sequence instantly. You don't treat symptoms until you've contained transmission vectors. You work backward from the outcome you want and identify what conditions have to hold first. Eisenhower didn't land troops until he'd neutralized the Luftwaffe, and you shouldn't scale sales until you've built category awareness in your target market. The sequence runs causally rather than preferentially. Skip a step and the entire operation falls apart. Companies that nail this sequence build awareness before building sales teams. They write content that gets shared organically within their target community. They speak at conferences where their buyers gather in concentration. They get analysts like Gartner and Forrester to define and cover their category publicly. They create the conditions for sales success by winning air superiority before launching the ground assault. HubSpot wrote the playbook that everyone else now follows. Before they built a significant sales team, they'd already coined the term inbound marketing and built an audience of hundreds of thousands of marketers who understood the concept deeply. They published a book explaining the philosophy. They created free tools and certifications that spread the vocabulary. They made inbound part of how marketers talked about their work. By the time salespeople started calling prospects, nobody asked what is inbound marketing anymore. They asked why HubSpot instead of the alternatives, and that represents a fundamentally different conversation with much higher conversion rates. If your sales team spends most of their time on category education, you haven't won air superiority yet. Go back to content, community, and awareness campaigns before you scale direct sales. The sequence matters enormously. Troops landing at Normandy didn't have to explain why the Allies wanted to defeat Hitler, because that battle had already been won in the minds of everyone involved. Your salespeople shouldn't have to explain why your category matters either. The fourth principle might feel counterintuitive when you first encounter it. It operates under the name acceptable loss planning. Eisenhower expected to lose 10,000 men on the first day of Operation Overlord, and his staff had modeled scenarios where casualties reached 20,000 before sunset. The actual number came to approximately 4,400 killed across all 5 beaches, devastating for the families affected but far below worst-case projections. And here's what matters. He launched anyway, knowing thousands would die, knowing some landing craft would sink, knowing some units would face annihilation, and knowing the invasion might still succeed despite all those losses. This approach sounds cold until you understand what it actually represents. Strategic realism separates leaders who act from leaders who wait forever for certainty that never arrives. Eisenhower understood that waiting for a risk-free option meant never acting at all. The weather would never reach perfection. Intelligence would never achieve completeness. The Germans would never present weaker opposition than they offered in June 1944. At some point, you accept the losses you can sustain, acknowledge the failures you can survive, and move forward decisively. That second letter in Eisenhower's pocket, the one accepting blame for failure, didn't signal defeatism. It provided evidence of planning for acceptable loss. He knew the invasion might fail. He'd thought through what failure would mean. He'd prepared to take responsibility publicly. That preparation gave him the psychological freedom to launch. Leaders who can't accept the possibility of failure never make decisions significant enough to achieve victory. The startup translation operates under the name failure tolerance, which differs sharply from failure acceptance. Failure acceptance represents defeatism. Failure tolerance means knowing which failures you can survive and structuring your company to sustain them when they arrive. Most founders I meet can articulate their upside scenarios with impressive precision. They'll explain how if this works, they'll hit $10 meters RR by year 3, raise a Series B at $100 meters valuation, and expand into Europe. Far fewer can articulate their failure modes with the same clarity. Answering what happens if this doesn't work should produce specifics like 8 months of runway remaining, 3 specific learnings about customer behavior, and the ability to pivot to an adjacent market they've already identified. The first response describes fantasy. The second describes strategy. Startups that survive their beach landings plan for partial failure as a default assumption. They structure burn rates so one failed quarter doesn't kill the company outright. They set up experiments with explicit kill criteria, meaning if they don't see a specific metric by a specific date, they stop the initiative, rather than open-ended commitments that fail slowly and drain resources. They raise slightly more capital than their base case requires. They build teams that can flex across functions when plans change. They give themselves room to learn from the inevitable mistakes that everyone makes. Airbnb nearly died multiple times during its early years, but each near-death experience happened at a point where they retained enough runway and accumulated enough insight to adapt. During the 2008 financial crisis, when fundraising dried up completely, they sold custom cereal boxes during the presidential election, packaging them as Obama O's and Cap'n McCain's, to generate cash and stay alive another few months. That response didn't emerge from luck or pure desperation. It emerged from having failure tolerance built into their operational structure. They'd planned for setbacks. They knew their acceptable losses. When the worst scenarios materialized, they still had moves available. Ask yourself this question directly. What's your Omaha Beach? Identify the part of your plan most likely to encounter unexpected resistance and go worse than expected. Have you structured your resources so you can sustain losses there and still establish the broader beachhead? Or have you gone all in on every element simultaneously, creating a situation where a single failure cascades into total defeat? Companies that survive don't limit their planning to success scenarios. They identify acceptable losses, structure resources to sustain them, and launch anyway, knowing things will go wrong somewhere. Eisenhower prepared to lose, and that preparation gave him the capacity to win. What Eisenhower's staff figured out in that cramped war room in 1944, and what the best startup operators keep relearning 8 decades later, reduces to a unified principle about deploying resources under uncertainty. Force concentration, logistics sequencing, air superiority, and acceptable loss planning don't function as separate ideas. They all express the same fundamental truth. When you have fewer resources than your opposition, your only advantage comes from focus. You cannot achieve strength everywhere simultaneously. You cannot eliminate all risk from your plan. You cannot wait for perfect conditions to emerge. You choose where to concentrate strength, build the infrastructure to sustain that strength over time, create the conditions for your attack to succeed, accept the losses you can survive, and move forward. The worst strategic error in war and in startups looks the same. Trying to eliminate all risk by covering all options feels safe and responsible. It feels like you're maximizing chances of success. What it actually guarantees is weakness everywhere. VCs call this approach spray and pray politely. Eisenhower's staff would have called it operational suicide. You end up with 5 failing beach landings instead of 1 successful one. The best strategic position doesn't emerge from broad coverage. It emerges from overwhelming strength in a narrow domain that can expand outward over time, which describes exactly what a beachhead provides. Next time you're planning go-to-market strategy, ask yourself the same questions Eisenhower asked his staff. Don't ask which market is biggest. Ask which market you can actually take with the forces you have available today. Don't ask how fast you can grow. Ask whether you can supply and serve the territory you capture without your systems breaking. Don't ask how you reach everyone. Ask whether you've won air superiority in your target segment first. Don't ask how you avoid all risk. Ask which failures you can survive and whether you've structured your organization to handle them. The best startups don't get built with the approach that feels safest. They get built with beachhead strategy. You just didn't have the vocabulary for it until now. Eisenhower carried those 2 letters on June 6, 1944. One prepared for victory and one prepared for defeat. He'd planned for both outcomes and structured his forces to handle both. And he launched anyway, knowing he couldn't control everything that followed. The invasion succeeded, not because everything went right. Omaha Beach turned into a bloodbath. Airborne drops scattered paratroopers across 50 miles of Normandy. Weather nearly postponed the whole operation multiple times. What made the invasion succeed was that the overall structure proved sound enough to absorb those failures. The beachhead held against counterattacks. The Mulberry harbors functioned as designed. Supply lines fed the expansion inland. Air superiority prevented effective German response. Acceptable losses got absorbed without breaking the operation's momentum. Your startup will face its own Omaha Beach at some point. Some part of your plan will go worse than expected. Some assumption will prove wrong under market pressure. Some competitor will move faster than you anticipated. The question isn't whether you'll face setbacks, because you will. The question is whether your overall structure can absorb those setbacks and still establish your foothold in the market. Military strategy and startup strategy appear completely unrelated at first glance, but the underlying principles connect everywhere because the underlying problem stays the same. How do you deploy finite resources to achieve an objective against entrenched opposition that possesses more resources, more distribution, and more time in market than you do? That question drives what we explore here. Hidden structures connect unrelated fields in ways that become obvious once you see them. Frameworks that worked for Eisenhower got rediscovered by Moore and articulated by Thiel and applied by the best operators, whether they know the history or not. If you want to see how other unexpected domains explain the strategic problems you face building companies, subscribe now. Next week, we're examining why Renaissance art workshops, the way Verrocchio trained Leonardo, and the way masters manage their apprentices explain modern engineering management better than any business school case study ever written. Comment below and tell me what you're thinking about. What's your startup's Normandy? Identify the one beachhead market where you could achieve true dominance if you stopped spreading thin. Find the segment where you could reach 2-to-1 force ratio against incumbent alternatives. I want to hear what you're considering and what's keeping you from committing to it fully. Because somewhere out there is a market segment that functions as your Utah beach, defensible terrain that suits your strengths, manageable opposition that you can actually overcome. A place where the forces you have today are enough to win. Find it before you run out of landing craft.